Erik, Chapter 16. Let me now lay out for you what you would have experienced if you had attended my opera. I had instructed that it be given a 3-week run, but events changed its fate. The opening performance did not even reach its conclusion. The opera, Don Juan Triumphant, was set in Renaissance Spain. The Lord, or Don Juan, had a household full of licentious servants who did far more flirting and betting of one another than actual household work. About the only task they accomplished efficiently was keeping clean sheets on all the beds, for obvious reasons. A new servant girl, Aminta, was brought into the household and was immediately seen as a potential conquest by all of the men, and even some of the women. The Don's manservant, Passerino, met Aminta one day at the well. He'd happened to be carrying his lord's distinctive cloak as he was on his way to drop it off at the laundry. Aminta hadn't met either the Don or Passerino up close, so she assumed that the man carrying the cloak was the Don. Passerino realized this and laughed about it later over wine with the Don. The Don, ever inventive with ways to get at the women in his employ, realized that as far as Aminta knew, he, the Don, could be mistaken for the manservant. He and Passerino hatched a plan. They would trade places for an evening. The Don would dine with Aminta, hiding his well-known face under a hooded cloak. He would pretend to be Passerino and invite Aminta to join him in sampling all the Don's luxury goods while the Don was away. After some time, Passerino was to come stomping in the door, pretending to be the Don. The actual Don, still cloaked, was to pretend to panic and take Aminta into his bedchamber to hide from the angry Don at the door. At that point, the poor girl's reputation would be destroyed. Unknown to the conspirators, Aminta was hidden nearby as they hatched this plan. The scene that occupied my full attention was the scene in which Aminta pretended to slowly realize that the cloaked figure was the Don. This was the scene in which I intended to step in and take over the lead bass's role, leaving the singer locked inside his dressing room. I knew it would feel especially real to me as I watched Christine slowly realize that the actor playing the Don was me. Hopefully this strong parallel between reality and fiction would prompt Christine to think of me as the lover she wanted, as Aminta thought so of the Don. I hadn't been able to get the singer playing the Don to stay quiescent inside his dressing room. I'd had my hand on his throat to prevent him from calling for help when he suddenly slumped over, unconscious. I didn't know whether he still lived or whether I'd accidentally killed him. They'd taken me at my word, and the singer was rather on the scrawny side. His defying me had made me so angry, it was quite possible I hadn't known my own strength. I'd been in too great a hurry to make it to the stage for my entrance to check on his well-being. Que sera, sera, I thought to myself grimly. There were far more important things at stake tonight. Aminta and the Don sang that they were both there to experience physical passion with the other. Christine and I circled each other on the stage, flirting close to each other and then sidling away. She tipped her head back to swallow a draught of wine, licking her lips as she lowered the cup. Finally, our duet reached its climax and we stood together at the center of the stage. I clasped her narrow waist in my hands as I had once before, and moved my head in over her shoulder to kiss her neck. Her head was thrown back onto my own shoulder in the perfect picture of overwhelming passion. I could feel her chest heaving under her corset and wondered how much of that was due to the exertion of singing. My music hung shimmering in the air as Christine stood feigning helplessness in my arms. This was my moment. I'd planned for the lights to have gone out already, but I forged ahead with my plan despite this small wrinkle. I whispered very softly in her ear. Don't you see, Christine? You and I can have this music, this passion, together for the rest of our lives. Raul can't give you this. Only I can. I have to have you. Marry me. My words caused a shock to run through her. I felt her immediately tense and turn halfway around to look at me. Before I could prevent her, she shot out a hand and ripped the cloak back from my head. I blinked in the sudden light. Everyone else in the theater froze as they beheld my white mask. I heard whispers of "The opera ghost" pouring from 100 throats, repeating and strengthening in the hush of the auditorium. My attention was caught by several men in the audience rising from their seats in the stalls, preparing to rush the stage, when three things happened almost at the same time. First, Christine, moved by who knows what impulse, grabbed the mask and hairpiece from my head. Suddenly, I stood on the stage in all the deformed wretchedness I was born with. Over 1,000 people witnessed the deformity that had caused my own mother to commit suicide. Cries of shock began to bounce around the room. I could see at least 5 women in the first 3 rows who had fainted and whose companions were frantically trying to revive them. Then, a crash from the ceiling indicated that the counterweight I had rigged had finally broken free of its melted cable. It plunged through the ceiling and fell like God's judgment on a woman in the stalls below. It was at that moment that I realized with horror I'd forgotten to warn the box office not to seat anyone there. I had murdered that patron as effectively as if I'd choked them with my lasso. The chandelier swayed above as if it, too, was shocked and reeling from the events transpiring below its polished globes. I was distracted from this, however, by the belated arrival of the blackout I had planned. Darkness descended on the auditorium in a heartbeat. The electric light disappeared with the suddenness that I, used to the slow fade of gaslight, hadn't completely anticipated. In the last remnants of the light, I charted my route back to the wings, where I had placed a lantern before coming on stage. I ran there through the darkness, pulling Christine behind me with an iron grip. I picked up the lantern and opened the forward-facing slide to let light shine out ahead of us. I rushed her over to the staircase leading down to my chambers. She uttered one shrill scream as we ran downwards into the cellars, but I slammed and locked the door at the top, preventing anyone from following us. I could hear the entire auditorium break out into pandemonium as the breaker was located and switched back on to reveal our disappearance. Christine struggled against me all the way down to my chambers, but I pulled her angrily along. Her taking my mask off in front of all those people seemed like pure spite on her part, and I was finding it hard to forgive her. I managed to get her into my boat, but had to grab for the collar of her costume as she showed signs of being about to pitch herself into the water and swim for freedom. The flimsy fabric tore as she lurched forward. I caught a tantalizing glimpse of her bare skin as the damaged costume slipped down over her shoulder before she grabbed it and jerked it back up, holding it there with her hand. She glared at me as she did so, but I shrugged off the look. I was not about to let my prize expose herself to God knew what miasmas lived in the dark water. I pulled her from the boat into my chambers. She fumbled to keep a hold on her torn costume as she got her feet onto solid land again. I knew there was only one other thing she could wear down here, the wedding dress. I ushered her to the door of her bedchamber, telling her she could either spend the next little while clutching the ruined fabric to her neck or change into the wedding dress. I watched her struggle to decide which outfit would arouse me the least. Soon Christine came out of the bedchamber too wrought up to remain inside. I sensed her scurry to the water's edge to try to take the boat in an escape bid, but I knew I had locked it securely to the little dock I had constructed. I turned to watch her. She had opted for the superior coverage of the wedding dress. I looked at her dressed up as my bride, but one small thing was missing. I stood up and walked toward her. I twisted the onyx ring I wore off my right hand. I wore it on my pinky in those days, as my hand had grown since the day I took it from its former owner. I picked up her left hand and forced my ring onto her third finger. It fit her perfectly. She looked up at me, wearing a curious expression on her face that mingled resignation with fear of what I might intend to do next. I stopped what I was doing as I saw the fear on her face. I went into my bedchamber to find another mask. I put it on to replace the one she had torn from me upstairs. I hoped this would make her a little less apprehensive. I walked back out into the main chamber and stood before her again. I could see her shoulders relax a little bit as she realized she didn't have to look at my face anymore. I picked up her hand and walked her back to her bedchamber. She didn't pull back as we entered the room. Suddenly, I bent, swept her off her feet and into my arms, and carried her the few steps to the bed. I set her gently down and sat beside her on the edge of the bed. I took her hands in mine. Christine, I feel I owe you an explanation. Long ago, I loved a woman, and she loved me in return, I think. But she belonged to another man, a man more powerful than I was. This man valued her only for her body, and one night he used her thoughtlessly and carelessly. He cared nothing for her mind or her soul, as I did. She was one among many who he treated like that. I had to stand guard to make sure no one interrupted them as he took her for the first time. And then I tried to comfort her afterward. It shattered her, and it broke my heart to see it. I took a deep breath. I greatly fear that I am about to watch the same thing happen again with you. You must have guessed that I love and adore you. I don't see Raoul being able to give you the musical experiences that you and I could have together, and I fear it will destroy some essential part of who you are. Her eyes widened as she finally understood the depth of my feelings for her and the reasons why I had acted as I did.
Oh, my angel. Erik, I had no idea. What a life you must have known.
A tear began to slip silently down her face. My heart leapt as I heard her use my name for the first time. I lifted my hand to her face to wipe away the tear, and she leaned her head into my hand. I kept my hand there and leaned forward. I pressed my lips to hers, and she gasped and froze up in sudden panic. I broke off and sat holding my breath, waiting for her reaction. Suddenly, she twined her hand around my neck and pulled me back to her for a deeper kiss. I wrapped my arms around her shoulders as I kissed her back. She leaned backward, pulling me toward her as we kissed. I leaned forward against her and savored the touch of her lips on mine. The kiss continued as she hugged me tightly. The next few minutes after that were like nothing I had ever experienced before. I am afraid that I fumbled quite a bit in the process because it was also brand new to me. But she had never experienced it either, so it was all right that I was not very good. Eventually, I rolled away and lay there, idly thanking my foresight in making a double bed for this room. I pulled the duvet, which I'd kicked to the foot of the bed at some point, back up over the both of us. After some time, I heard Christine groping over the bedside table and sat up to see if I could help her find something. But she found the lamp and turned it up, sending light flaring around the entire room. I checked to make sure my mask hadn't been knocked askew as the light revealed us to each other. Christine looked at me in the bed beside her and paused for a moment. Then she reached out and gently took the mask from my head. I instinctively turned my face away from her and clapped my hand over it. Her hand under my jaw brought my head back around to face her, and then she took my covering hand down and held it in hers. My onyx ring gleamed from her finger as she did so. She stared at the ruin of my face. I could only look back at her pleadingly. I felt laid bare by the intensity of her gaze. Our eyes met, and I felt as if she was seeing me. the person I am inside my head. She raised her other hand and gently touched the ruined flesh of my face. I closed my eyes, and she lifted her hand hastily.
Did I hurt you? Does it?
She broke off awkwardly, pulling her hand back to herself. No, my dear, I replied shyly. I've just never felt anyone else's hand there. It's peculiar, but nice. She smiled at me uncertainly, then was silent for a few minutes, lost in thought. I laid back down against the pillows, reliving the last hour in my mind. Her voice eventually dragged me back to the room.
You know, it doesn't define you. I don't think it does. Anyways.
Startled, I remembered we had been speaking of my face. I turned over to face her in the bed and asked her what she meant.
Well, I get the sense that people expect you to be an immoral, criminal, corrupt murderer once they see your face. An immoral, criminal, corrupt murderer certainly ought to have a face like yours. But you're a musician, a composer, a carpenter, a well-traveled, well-read man. Someone who looks at a problem and devises a solution to it. Brilliant solutions sometimes. But I think sometimes you set out to give people what they expect, which is why Bouquet is dead, and why someone's been hurt tonight by whatever fell through the ceiling.
I felt an unexpected wave of shame wash over me as she enumerated my offenses. She continued,
I wish you would try to put forward the brilliant, kind, loving side of yourself. I think you're capable of loving and being loved. But no one will ever see it in you if you continue as you have in the past. I wish you would promise me that after tonight, you'll try to show that side to the world instead.
I paused, overcome by conflicting emotions. On one hand, I was astounded at the insight she displayed. I felt understood as I never had before. On the other hand, Christine still had no idea of the life I had led. I shuddered to think what might have happened to me in the world of the traveling fair if I had displayed the vulnerability I had tonight with her. I conceded that I could probably coax my thinking a little further toward the light, and I told her I would try to do as she asked. She smiled broadly and kissed me again. Then her arms found their way around my neck, and she pulled me down to her once more.